Modes can sound confusing because they use all these Greek names, but the basic concept behind them is simple. We're taking a major scale and starting in different places. So for example, here's our C major scale. This is also called the Ionian mode. And if I take this same set of 7 notes, all the white keys, and I start at a different point in the scale, I can find another mode. So here, starting on the 2nd note, and then ending on that same note, this is Dorian. So Dorian starts on the 2 of the major scale. 3 would be Phrygian. 4 is Lydian. 5, Mixolydian. 6 is Aeolian. And 7, Locrian. Now, in modern use, we can transpose any of these. So we can do the same thing with any other major scale. Let's say A flat major. That's our Ionian mode. Here's Dorian. So this would be B flat Dorian, C Phrygian, D Lydian, and so on. So I'm using the same set of 7 notes that we found in A flat major. I'm just starting the sequence in a different spot. And it's really just those 7 names, those 7 Greek names that I rattled off, that you're likely to come across in modern music theory. So if you care about knowing these Greek names, I suggest just memorizing them in relationship to the number for where they start in the major scale. So 2 is Dorian, 4 is Lydian, so on. And if you know your major scales, it becomes pretty easy to find any mode that you might want to find. If you're not familiar with all 12 major scales, you're welcome to grab my PDF guide to all 12 major scales. So let's practice finding a random mode together and look at a few ways you can do that. Along the way, we'll also talk about when this concept of modes is actually useful. Okay, for an example, let's find D Lydian. You can find any mode 3 ways. You could look for the related major scale. You can modify another familiar scale that starts on the same root note. Or you can just think about the mode as a pure set of whole and half steps. Let's start by using the first approach. So D Lydian. Lydian starts on the 4th note of a major scale. So I need to find the major scale whose 4th note is D. And I can reverse engineer that. Okay, that's got to be A. So if I start and end on D, but I use the notes of an A major scale, that gets me to D Lydian. Let's use one other example. Let's say we want C Phrygian. Okay, I need to find the major scale that uses C as its 3rd note. That would be A flat major. And then I'm going to think of all the notes in A flat major. And that gets me to C Phrygian. Okay, so this is one way of thinking about modes, that you're just always going to be thinking of the related major scale. And it means that you have to do a little bit of math if someone throws a mode at you. I don't know, say A Mixolydian. You have to first think about what key is A, the 5 of. And that can be a little bit confusing or time-consuming when you're first doing this. But I think that this is actually a pretty good way to think about your modes and to practice with the modes. Full disclosure, this is basically the only way that I ever practiced with modes. I was always thinking of the related major scale. But the cool thing about it is that it kind of breaks you out of only thinking of your major scales in one way. So if I'm only used to playing D major, for example, starting and ending on D, it's not that useful in the context of real music. It's not that useful if I want to improvise or write a piece of music using that scale. Modes break you out of that. Modes force you to find a way to play that same set of notes, starting and ending at a different point in the scale. And this is actually closely related to my common practice suggestion for people when they're learning their major scales for the purpose of writing music or improvising or learning by ear. You want to practice the scale out of order. And so a fun way of doing this is transposing simple melodies. You take a melody and you put it in all 12 keys. Basically, when you do that, you're still practicing the scale, but you're just practicing it in the order that the notes come in the melody. But modes are another way to do this, where basically it's a major scale starting and ending in a different spot than you're used to. And so you have to think about that palette of notes. In this case, I'm thinking about D major. You have to think about that palette of notes in a less familiar way. And the more that you throw these kind of unfamiliar ways of thinking about the same set of 12 major scales at your brain, the easier it gets to be to just see every scale as a palette of available notes, almost like your keyboard is lit up with all of the notes that belong to a given scale. And that's really the useful skill that we're looking for if we want to use our scales as a composer or improviser, or be familiar enough with the sound of the scale to turn everything into numbers, scale degrees, and learn things by ear. I didn't go to Berklee, I went to USC, but I've heard it said that one of the first things they make you do when you arrive at Berklee is they make you learn all your modes. And, modes actually don't come up that often in the world of music, but I can still see why this exercise might be useful. And it's something that you might want to explore if you're looking for ways to get more comfortable with the layout of the piano keyboard. You could just quiz yourself, either, pick a note, say E flat, and try to go through all the modes, and you'll have to engineer figuring out which major scale is going to get me to the mode that I want. Or, you could take a certain mode, say Phrygian, and play it in all 12 keys. That would be another way to practice all your modes. But in either case, for now, we're just thinking of it as a problem where you need to find the related major scale. You're always referring back to the major scale that perfectly matches with a given mode. There's another approach that I think is also useful to explore, where instead you're going to think of a parallel major scale and modify it slightly. A great example of this would be Lydian. So I just think of Lydian as a major scale with a raised fourth. That's all it is. C Lydian is identical to C major, but I've raised the fourth scale degree. And in a way, this is a more direct and kind of pure way of thinking about modes, because now I'm just thinking about this as its own scale. I'm not having to refer it back to G major. And the thing is, there are some musical situations where you're really using modes. It's not just an exercise. There are pieces of music that are Lydian sounding or Mixolydian sounding or Dorian. I'd say those are the most commonly used ones in most styles of music. Phrygian and Locrian are pretty uncommon. But at least with those three, so Lydian, Mixolydian, and Dorian, it's kind of nice to just be able to quickly find the mode, either by being really comfortable with the mode unto itself or by modifying a parallel major or a parallel minor scale. And this will also get you closer to just being really comfortable with the sound of a mode unto itself. So the shortcuts there are, for Lydian, you raise the fourth of a major scale. For Mixolydian, you lower the seventh of a major scale. And for Dorian, you raise the sixth of a natural minor scale. And just for a little more musical context, I think Dorian mostly comes up, it's famously used in a classic piece of modal jazz, the song So What by Miles Davis, and that's in D Dorian, which is great because it just uses white keys. And they're really clearly playing in D Dorian. It's not in C major, and then they're just calling it D Dorian. Everything is centered around D. So it has this very particular sound of a Dorian scale or Dorian mode. And Dorian also comes up in some pieces, I'd say like soul and R&B, it can come up in a sense where you're hanging out on the 2 chord, so that makes it Dorian, but you never actually go to 1. And just hanging out there on that 2 chord gives it this Dorian sound. So that's another situation in which I'll find myself thinking about Dorian. Lydian is a sound that's really nice. A lot of people will throw it in at the end of a piece as this sort of mysterious sounding final chord. But it's also something that I'd say it gets used in film music for this sort of like open, mysterious sound, or like a pastoral sound, like you're in the countryside. It's a very bright sound. And Mixolydian makes me think of blues because the 1 chord in blues is often played as a dominant 7 chord. So You could think of the blues scale when you're playing a blues, but you can also think of Mixolydian, which is identical to a major scale, but just has that lowered seventh that goes along with a dominant 7 chord. So those are some real-world musical examples of how Dorian, Lydian, and Mixolydian actually get used. And because those three get used the most, I think with those, it's good to just have this little reference. How can you quickly modify a parallel major or minor scale to find each of those modes? And then the last way that you could find a given mode would be to use just a pure sequence of whole and half steps. So for C Phrygian, for example, half, whole, 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 half, whole, whole. I flubbed that at the beginning because, frankly, I have never used this way of finding modes, and I don't think it's very practical. So this is one of those things in music theory where, like, there's kind of a shortcut to get there, like referring to the identical major scale or referring to a parallel major or minor scale, and it might feel like, oh gosh, if I'm using the shortcut, I'm sort of cheating. I should really just know the mode unto itself, and at least for me, with my relationship to modes and how I've used them in my life as a musician, the shortcut has been plenty. I haven't really had to ever memorize modes as a sequence of whole and half steps. Modes, I think, are a great example of one of these things in music theory where you can get a little overwhelmed if you are an adult student who's perfectionistic about wanting to learn everything having to do with music theory and understand it on the deepest possible level. And it can feel like, oh my gosh, until I know all of my modes cold without having to refer to another major or minor scale, I don't really know music theory. And I'm here to tell you, give yourself a little bit of a break. The only way that I ever practiced modes was, I think at some point when I was a teenager, I sort of sat down and quizzed myself on finding them by referring back to the identical major scale. And that's it. And then they come up every now and then when someone's trying to communicate about what's going on in a certain piece of music. But, I've been playing music my whole life and I'm a professional musician, and I always have to kind of think for a sec to remember, okay, if I'm looking for A flat Phrygian, that means it has to be E major. So there might be other musicians who use these all the time. They're always playing pieces of music that are using the Phrygian mode, but I'm not one. So if you aren't one, then I wouldn't stress about it too much. And there's our overview of modes. I hope you've enjoyed, and I hope this sheds some light on how you might think about this music theory concept and use it in your own practice. My name is Ted with Piano Fluency.